When Victoria Ashmore snapped her fingers in the direction of the nearest server, the sound carried across the entire ballroom the way a crack of ice does across a frozen lake in February. Sharp, sudden, and demanding that everyone within earshot take notice. She had been seated at table 1 for less than 4 minutes before she found the temperature wrong, the chair arrangement inadequate, and the floral centerpiece positioned in a way that blocked her sightline to the door. When Grant Thibodeau approached with the wine list, she did not look at him. She was still speaking to the man beside her about a quarterly projection, and she simply extended one hand sideways, the way a person might hold something out for a dog to take, and waited for Grant to fill it. When he gently explained that the Chablis she'd requested had already been allocated to the private tasting room on the floor above, she turned for the first time and looked at him fully. Then she told everyone at the table, loudly enough for the next 2 tables to hear as well, that hotel service had been declining for years in this city, and that it was remarkable how a man could spend decades carrying trays without learning how the industry actually worked. Grant did not lower his eyes. He set the wine list on the table with the same care he used for everything, and asked whether she was still planning to proceed with the meeting scheduled for 9 o'clock the following morning. Victoria Ashmore laughed out loud. Her lawyer, seated 3 chairs away, stopped laughing almost immediately. Grant Thibodeau spent the last half hour before his evening shift the same way he spent most evenings when he wasn't at the hotel. Standing at the counter in their narrow Oakville kitchen, halving cherry tomatoes, while his 17-year-old daughter Cora sat at the table behind him, working through a physics problem set she'd been staring at since supper. She looked up without lifting her pencil and asked, almost as an aside, whether he was finally going to quit the hotel after the software company sold. Grant told her he hadn't sold anything yet, and that the dollar figure attached to a deal mattered a great deal less than whether the buyer intended to use the technology the right way. Cora made the sound teenagers make when a parent says something they've heard before but still half believe. There was affection in it, which Grant had learned to read underneath the exasperation. She had grown up watching him live 2 lives at once without ever complaining about either one, and some part of her, the part that still left his coffee mug on the counter every morning without being asked, understood the shape of what he was doing even when she didn't fully understand why. 5 years earlier, after her mother passed, Grant had left his position as a systems engineer at a mid-sized infrastructure firm in Mississauga and taken the hotel job. The hours were predictable in a way that engineering contracts never were. He could be home by midnight on most nights, could be there when Cora got in from school, could sit with her through the dinner she now mostly cooked herself, and the homework she no longer needed his help with. The grief in those first months had been the kind that takes up space in a room without making a sound. He had learned to carry it alongside everything else. Grid sense had grown out of the late hours after Cora went to bed, not from ambition, not in any way Grant would have named as such at the time. It had grown because he needed somewhere to put his mind when the apartment was too quiet, and because the problem he'd been working on, how to predict failure points in aging electrical grid infrastructure before they cascaded into blackouts, was the kind of problem that didn't let go once it found you. He had sketched the earliest version on the back of hotel order pads during slow Tuesday nights, refined it on his days off, and quietly built something that, 4 years later, 3 of Canada's largest power utilities were now in active negotiations to license. He kissed the top of Cora's head, told her not to stay up past 11, and left for his shift at the Fairmont the way he always did, in his gray peacoat over the uniform he'd change into in the staff room, walking the 10 minutes from the GO station through the October cold that had arrived 2 weeks earlier than anyone expected. His phone buzzed just as he reached King Street. A message from his lawyer, Owen Sato, confirming that Vantage Power Corporation's board had approved the full licensing agreement at $92 million, and that only Grant's signature stood between the company and the largest private energy technology deal in Ontario's recent history. The signing was scheduled for 9 the following morning. Grant read the message twice, slipped the phone back into his coat pocket, and pushed through the hotel's staff entrance on Adelaide. Ruth Mackay, the hotel's banquet manager, and one of the few people outside his daughter who had known Grant in the years before and after his wife's death, was waiting for him near the linen trolley. With the particular expression she reserved for information she would have preferred not to deliver. She told him that Vantage Power had added 12 guests to the private dinner in the main ballroom, that the server originally assigned to the executive tables had called in sick, and that she'd had no choice but to reassign the section to him. Grant was already pulling on his jacket. He asked her to send the updated seating chart to his section tablet. Ruth lowered her voice and said that Vantage's CEO was on the reservation herself, that her name was Victoria Ashmore. Grant didn't answer right away. He straightened his collar in the mirror by the staff door and thought about the fact that the woman who was scheduled to sign a $92 million agreement with him tomorrow morning was about to sit down at one of his tables tonight. He had insisted from the start of negotiations that his identity remain undisclosed until the final signing. He had wanted the technology to be evaluated on its merit, not on assumptions people made when they learned the founder worked evenings in hospitality. He told Ruth it was fine. He told her he'd manage the section. She looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. Then she let him go. The ballroom had already settled into its rhythm by the time the Vantage party arrived. The low sound of cutlery on good china, the particular hum of a room full of people performing importance at one another. Grant had worked enough of these evenings to read a table before it opened its mouth, and something about the energy trailing in behind Victoria Ashmore felt familiar in a way he didn't particularly welcome. It was the energy of someone who had confused deference with respect for so long that she'd stopped distinguishing between them. Victoria Ashmore was somewhere in her mid-50s, put together with the kind of precision that came from having people whose entire job was to ensure she looked that way. She walked into the ballroom as though the space had been arranged around the fact of her arrival. She complained about the centerpiece before she sat down. She asked whether the table closest to the kitchen could be repositioned, even though it was with 12 place settings and the dinner was already 20 minutes from service. When Grant approached to offer the wine selection, she was mid-sentence to the man beside her and simply held out her hand without turning. He presented the list. She chose a Chablis that had been reserved for the private tasting event upstairs, and, when Grant explained this, turned and looked at him for the first time. She asked how long he'd been working in hotels. Before he could answer, she had turned back to the table and was telling Blake Sorensen, her chief operating officer, that the service industry in this country had become remarkable in its ability to produce people who could memorize a menu without understanding the concept of client priority. Blake laughed the way people laugh at their employer's jokes when they've done it so many times. It no longer requires conscious thought. Grant had long since stopped taking that particular kind of comment personally. He had learned something in 5 years of hotel work that he hadn't learned in 15 years of engineering. That people who needed to diminish the person standing in front of them rarely had a single clear reason, and that the impulse usually said something about the fear underneath it rather than the person it was aimed at. He noted it. He did not show that he'd noted it. He excused himself to arrange an appropriate alternative for the wine. An hour into the dinner, a junior server named Paul Lemieux accidentally placed a starter at the wrong seat. Victoria caught it immediately and said clearly enough for the adjacent tables to hear that this was precisely the problem with hiring people who hadn't been properly trained. Grant stepped forward and told her the error had been his, redirecting her attention away from Paul entirely. It was untrue and both of them knew it, but Paul was 19 and 3 months into his first hotel position, and Grant was not interested in watching him absorb the cost of someone else's need for a target. Later, when a small splash of sparkling water landed near the base of Victoria's chair, she pointed at Grant and told him to get down and deal with it personally. Even though a housekeeping attendant was already moving toward the table with the correct equipment, Grant handled it with the same quiet professionalism he brought to everything, and his complete refusal to be rattled by her tone visibly displeased. A woman who was accustomed to watching people contract under the force of her displeasure. The turning point came when Blake Sorensen made an offhand comment about grid maintenance cycles in Ontario, a comment that was wrong in a specific and consequential way, the kind of error that only mattered if you understood the infrastructure architecture that GridSense was designed to monitor. Grant corrected him, briefly, without elaboration, and without drawing attention to the fact that he had done so. Victoria turned and looked at him with an entirely different expression than the one she'd been wearing all evening. She told him loudly and carefully to stay in his lane. Then she said something that the tables on either side heard without difficulty. She said that a man who spent his life refilling water glasses ought to understand the difference between the people who operated the economy and the people who served it, that people like her built companies, that people like him kept the lights on in the ballroom, and nothing more. Grant looked at her with the same expression he'd had all evening, level, unhurried, unbothered in a way that was not performance, and asked whether she was still planning to be at the signing at 9 the following morning. Victoria laughed. She turned to Blake as though sharing a private joke about the quality of the help, and Blake performed his part dutifully. She told Grant he had a remarkable imagination for a man in his position and that she'd be speaking to management about the service before she left tonight. 20 minutes later, she did exactly that. She told Grant in front of 4 of his colleagues that his service had been inadequate, that his attitude toward paying clients was inappropriate, and that correcting a guest during a private dinner was precisely the kind of overreach that explained why the industry struggled to maintain professional standards. She placed a folded bill on the edge of the table and kept 2 fingers pressed flat against it. She told him he could take it once he acknowledged that he had spoken out of turn. Grant slid it back without touching it. He told her that an apology wasn't currency, and a tip wasn't an instrument of correction. The silence that followed was not comfortable for anyone at the table. Victoria demanded that Ruth Mackay come to the table. When Ruth arrived, Victoria told her that Grant needed to be removed from the floor immediately and that Vantage Power's business relationship with the Fairmont, which included 3 annual corporate retreats and a standing booking for the executive suite block, would need to be reconsidered if the hotel could not manage its service staff more effectively. Ruth told her, without raising her voice, that Grant had handled the evening with complete professionalism and that she stood behind his service without reservation. Victoria was still responding to this when Owen Sato walked into the ballroom. Owen was accompanied by Diana Cheong, Vantage Power's general counsel, and both of them were there to confirm the final administrative details before the morning signing. Owen saw Grant immediately, saw the tray in his hand, the server's jacket, the posture of a man absorbing something without breaking, and something moved across his face that was not quite alarm but was very close to it. Diana Chung saw it too. She looked from Owen to Grant and back again, and the color left her face in the particular way it does when a person understands. All at once, the full weight of a mistake they cannot undo. Victoria was still speaking. She was pointing at Grant and asking Ruth whether it was hotel policy to allow service staff to address corporate clients as though they were colleagues. Owen said her name. She turned. He told her clearly, in the same quiet voice he used in boardrooms, that the man she was pointing at was Grant Thibodeau. The room did not go silent exactly, but the vantage table did. Victoria looked at Owen. Then she looked at Grant. She repeated the name as though testing whether it would do anything other than simply sit there. Owen explained that Grant Thibodeau was the founder and sole owner of True North Grid Systems, that he had developed grid sense over the past 4 years, that he held every licensing right to the technology Vantage had been negotiating to acquire since the previous spring, and that the only signature standing between Vantage and a $92 million exclusive agreement was the one belonging to the man she had just told to stay in his lane. Diana Chung opened the briefing folder she was carrying and compared the identification photograph inside against the man standing in front of her. She closed the folder. Victoria's expression moved through several stages in about 4 seconds. The last one was calculation. She told Grant that the evening had clearly been a misunderstanding, that she had not been aware of who he was, that the pressure of a major signing had made her short-tempered, and that she was certain they could move past this professionally. She offered in short succession to increase the licensing fee by $7 million, to issue a joint press statement crediting Grant by name, and to arrange a media announcement framing the partnership as a national model of Canadian engineering innovation. Grant listened to each offer and declined each one. Victoria shifted her tone. She told him that a man in his position should think carefully about walking away from a deal of this magnitude. That Vantage had legal options if he chose to breach the negotiating framework, that his reputation in the industry was not yet large enough to survive the kind of friction a company of Vantage's size could generate. Grant set his tray down on the serving station behind him. He told Victoria that what concerned him was not the money and not the threat. He told her that the belief underneath everything she had said tonight, the belief that the uniform defined what a person was worth, that the job told the complete story of the person wearing it, was the same belief she would have carried into every decision she made about the communities. Grid sense was designed to protect, and that this was why he was no longer interested in what she was offering. He asked Owen, in front of everyone at the table, to send the formal notice withdrawing True North Grid Systems from all negotiations with Vantage Power Corporation. Victoria told him, in a voice meant for him alone, that he had just made the most expensive decision of his career, and that she would see to it personally. He watched her leave through the ballroom doors. The room behind her was quiet in the way rooms go quiet after something has shifted that cannot be unshifted. By the following afternoon, Vantage's communications office had released a statement describing a software developer who had withdrawn from a near-finalized agreement without cause in order to seek leverage for a higher price. Grant's name appeared in 3 business publications within 24 hours. 2 of the articles mentioned that he worked in hotel service. The implication in each case was the same, that the technology's value had been overstated, that the man behind it was not a serious partner, that the withdrawal was a symptom of inexperience dressed up as principle. Blake Sorensen reached out directly to 2 of True North's earliest investors, suggesting that Grant had forfeited the company's only realistic path to scale. One investor called Grant that evening to express concern. A second asked to schedule a review of the company's financials. The pressure was measured and deliberate, and Grant recognized the shape of it. The Fairmont received a wave of coordinated reviews on 3 separate platforms over the course of a single Thursday. 17 of them appeared within 4 hours of each other, all citing service quality, all describing a specific server without using his name. 3 corporate clients canceled standing reservations that same week. Ruth said nothing to Grant about the financial impact, but he could see it in the way she had started arriving earlier and staying later, in the set of her shoulders when she thought no one was watching. He had known Ruth since the year his wife was diagnosed. She had covered his shifts without being asked during the month of the final hospitalization and had shown up at the apartment afterward, with food he hadn't had the presence of mind to prepare. She had never once treated his grief as an inconvenience, or his hotel work as something requiring explanation, and the thought that his refusal to be diminished was now costing her something she had spent more than a decade building settled in him like a weight that wouldn't shift. Cora noticed it. She asked him one evening, while they were doing the dishes, whether what he was holding on to was worth what it was asking of the people around him. Grant didn't have an easy answer. He told her he was still working that out. He requested access to Vantage's full implementation plan for GridSense, a document he had never been shown in its complete form during negotiations. When Lydia Cartwright, the chair of Vantage's board, arranged a meeting at Grant's request, Owen attended and pressed for the unredacted planning file. What they found in the final appendix had not been shared at any point in the process. Buried in the projections was Vantage's actual intended use for the technology: a phased decommissioning of 31 remote substations across northern Ontario and Manitoba over an 18-month period, with GridSense's predictive data used to justify each closure as a managed infrastructure decision rather than what it actually was. A cost-cutting exercise dressed in the language of engineering necessity. 14 of those substations served Indigenous communities with no alternative grid connection. The closures would have been presented as proactive maintenance. The communities would have had no mechanism to appeal or dispute the findings. The supplier protection clauses Grant had specifically negotiated, provisions requiring independent community consultation before any GridSense-informed decommissioning decision, had been quietly removed from the version submitted to Vantage's board. Victoria had reviewed the removal and approved it. The version of the agreement Grant had seen during due diligence was not the version the board had voted on. Grant sat with the file long after Owen had gone home. The office hummed with the quiet of servers and cooling systems, a sound that had become so familiar over 4 years that he sometimes heard it as a kind of company. He thought about the engineers at True North who had trusted him to protect what they'd built together. He thought about the communities in the North that the technology was supposed to serve, that it had always been designed to serve, from the early sketches on hotel order pads through to the production model that could now predict a cascade failure 3 hours before it reached the threshold line. He had built GridSense specifically because grid failures in remote communities did not receive the same response time as grid failures in cities, and he had watched this disparity matter in ways that were impossible to forget. He did not sleep that night. When Cora found him at the kitchen table before dawn, he was still reading. She made coffee without asking and sat beside him, in the particular silence she'd learned from years of watching him carry things that couldn't be set down yet. Lydia Cartwright argued that infrastructure rationalization was a standard feature of large-scale technology integration, and pressed Grant to return to the table. Victoria's final offer arrived shortly after. The original $92 million restored, plus an additional $8 million if Grant would issue a public statement attributing his withdrawal to a misalignment of timelines and making no reference to events at the Fairmont. Grant declined to sell his silence at any price. 2 investors withdrew their funding within the week. True North had approximately 10 weeks of operating capital remaining. The engineers who had stayed through the hardest months of development now faced the prospect of watching the company they had built from nothing dissolve. Not because the technology had failed, but because the man who owned it had refused to look away from something that mattered. Diana Chung called Owen late on a Wednesday evening, her voice careful in the way voices are when a person is saying something they cannot yet say in writing. She told him that Victoria was not simply attempting to negotiate a better price. She was attempting to reconstruct GridSense without paying for it. Vantage had retained a former contractor who had worked briefly with True North 2 years prior. The contractor did not possess the source code, but understood enough of GridSense's architecture to serve as a foundation for a parallel development effort. Victoria's plan was to unveil an internally developed platform close enough to GridSense to make a licensing agreement unnecessary, then absorb whatever legal challenge True North could afford to mount, which, given the company's current capital position, was not expected to be much. Diana was not yet prepared to testify. She offered Owen enough of a thread to pull. When True North's technical team examined the access logs from their early development environment, they found what they were looking for. A contractor account linked to a third-party consulting firm had extracted a set of structural architecture diagrams from an archived prototype environment. No source code had been transferred directly, but the blueprints were enough. Grant's lead engineer identified the access pattern within 48 hours. The security consultant responsible for that system, a man named Fergus Lamb, had accepted the consulting work without understanding who was ultimately behind the request. When Grant called him in to review the logs, Lamb confirmed what the data already showed. Rather than terminating him, Grant asked Lamb to help trace exactly what had been taken and where it had gone, reasoning that a cooperative and honest account was more useful than a quiet dismissal. Vantage held a press conference 2 weeks later. Victoria announced that the company had developed its own predictive infrastructure monitoring system entirely in-house, and described it as a demonstration of Canadian engineering capability. She referred to Grant, without using his name, as a developer who had mistaken a negotiating moment for more than it was. True North's engineers found what they needed inside Vantage's demonstration build within 24 hours of its public release. Grant had embedded an identification signature deep in an early prototype years before Vantage had ever expressed interest in licensing GridSense. Its presence in Vantage's code was not ambiguous. The morning of Vantage's emergency board meeting arrived gray and cold, the CN Tower barely visible through the low cloud over the lake. Grant stood on Front Street for a moment before going in, his breath white in the November air, thinking about the fact that he had stood outside buildings like this, dozens of times over the years, as a delivery contact, as a contractor, as a server for corporate events, and that no one inside had ever wondered who he was. He had no particular feeling about that now, no grievance left to carry. He simply understood what the next hour needed to accomplish and intended to walk into the room the same way. He approached a difficult section on a busy night, calmly, without being rattled, and without mistaking quiet for weakness. Lydia Cartwright had convened the session to determine whether Vantage would proceed with a lawsuit against True North for breach of negotiation. Victoria arrived, looking like someone who had already rehearsed the ending. When Grant walked in, she observed without warmth that the boardroom was not typically a venue for outside personnel to attend without an invitation. Grant told her he understood precisely what kind of meeting this was, and that this time she was the one waiting on a decision that wasn't hers to make. Owen presented the evidence in sequence: the unredacted implementation plan and the decommissioning projections for the northern substations. Documentation showing the supplier protection clauses had been deliberately removed from the board's version of the contract. The technical analysis confirming that Vantage's new platform had been built from True North's stolen architecture. Fergus Lamb's signed account of the access request and who had originated it. The surveillance record showing the initial contact had been made through Blake Sorensen's office, and Diana Chung, who had arrived that morning prepared, finally, to confirm that she had preserved the original unedited board correspondence on Vantage's own legal servers. Victoria told the room the documents had been selectively interpreted. Blake said nothing at all. Several board members remained quiet for a long moment. Lydia Cartwright asked whether a resolution existed that allowed Vantage to retain access to GridSense through a restructured agreement. Grant let the question settle before he answered. He told the room that the opportunity to reach an agreement with Vantage Power no longer existed. He told them he had signed a different agreement at 8:30 that morning before coming to this meeting. True North Grid Systems had entered into a licensing partnership with the Northern Infrastructure Cooperative, a consortium of 63 municipal utilities, 3 provincial distribution companies, and 4 Indigenous-led energy authorities across Northern Ontario, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. The agreement was valued at $106 million over a 12-year term. The terms included no forced decommissioning of any substation serving a community without independent review and community consent. A mandatory consultation process for any GridSense-informed infrastructure decision affecting remote or underserviced communities. Equity shares distributed to True North's engineering team, a retraining fund for grid workers whose roles were modified by the technology's implementation, and an ongoing audit right retained by True North over how GridSense data was applied, retained permanently, not subject to renegotiation. Grant had not chosen the cooperative because the number was slightly larger. He had chosen them because they had been willing to sign the agreement he had always intended to sign. Vantage's share price fell before the meeting concluded. The Northern infrastructure contracts the company had been counting on to justify its Q1 projections disappeared within the week. Lydia Cartwright, watching the numbers update on the board display, seemed to finally understand the complete shape of what Victoria's decisions had cost the company. Not merely the technology itself, but the competitive position that now belonged, irrevocably, to a cooperative network instead. Victoria made one last attempt at the room. She said that the outcome reflected poorly on True North's willingness to act in good faith, and that a founder who chose to prioritize personal feeling over business judgment was unlikely to be a reliable long-term partner to anyone. Grant looked at her and said that she still believed a man's uniform told the complete story of his worth, and that this belief was exactly why she had never understood what she was negotiating against from the very beginning. Lydia asked Grant to step outside while the board prepared to vote. The vote was not close. Victoria Ashmore was suspended from her role as chief executive pending a formal investigation into the misappropriation of proprietary technology, the deliberate concealment of the decommissioning plan from her own board, and the coordinated reputational campaign against both True North Grid Systems and the Fairmont. She forfeited the performance bonuses tied to the international expansion targets she would never reach, surrendered unvested stock options, and lost the authority to represent Vantage in any external negotiation of any kind. Blake Sorensen was terminated the same afternoon. Victoria left the building still giving instructions to her assistant, though no one in the office was any longer required to receive them. She appeared at the Fairmont that evening, where Grant had arranged a small gathering to mark the cooperative agreement. She walked up to Ruth Mackay and demanded, in almost precisely the same tone she had used 3 weeks earlier, that the server responsible for the private dining section be removed from the premises. Ruth answered her without raising her voice or changing her expression. She told Victoria that Grant Thibodeau was not serving any tables tonight. He was the guest of honor, and her name had already been removed from every reservation in the building. If she needed to be escorted out, that could be arranged without any disruption to the evening. Victoria stood there for a moment, mouth slightly open, the particular stillness of a person roaching for authority they no longer possess and finding nothing there. Around her, the room continued. Servers made their rounds. Guests returned to their conversations. The mechanics of the evening required nothing from her, accommodated nothing, waited for nothing. A security manager appeared at her elbow politely, and she left. Grant used a portion of the cooperative agreement's upfront payment to compensate the Fairmont for the financial damage caused by the coordinated review campaign. He established a skills development fund for hotel and service industry workers interested in transitioning into infrastructure technology roles. He granted equity shares to the engineers who had remained with True North through the months when departure would have been the sensible choice. He ensured that Fergus Lamb's cooperation was formally noted in a way that protected rather than ended his career, and he created an oversight committee, drawn from the cooperative's member communities, specifically designed to ensure that no grid-sense-driven recommendation could be enacted without a human review process that included the people most directly affected by the outcome. Ruth offered Grant a formal stake in the hotel's ongoing renovation project, which he accepted on the condition that every member of the banquet and events staff receive a meaningful share in the benefit. She didn't argue. Grant no longer worked regular shifts at the Fairmont, but he still came in on certain evenings, the busy ones, the understaffed ones, the ones where an extra pair of experienced hands made a real difference. Not to demonstrate anything, and not because he felt he owed anyone a performance of humility. He came because he had never believed that carrying a tray made a person smaller, and he saw no reason to start believing it now. 6 months after the board meeting, the Fairmont hosted a fundraising dinner for the Northern Skills Initiative. The fund Grant had established for service workers pursuing technology careers. Grant was there as an organizer, which meant he was also there in the kitchen at 7, helping with the mise en place, and on the floor by 8, moving between tables. Cora had come that night. She stood near the service entrance watching her father cross the room with a tray of water glasses, and she asked him, with the kind of directness she had always had, even as a small child, why a man who had just signed a deal worth over $100 million was still carrying water across a ballroom floor. Grant set the tray down on the station nearest him and thought about the question for a moment before he answered. He said there was a difference between being placed somewhere by another person's verdict and choosing that same place by your own measure. That when a person did honest work with dignity, no one else in the world had the power to make that work mean less than it was. And that the only people who believed otherwise, he said, were people who had spent so long confusing deference with respect that they had finally lost the ability to tell them apart. A guest at a nearby table, someone who had no idea who Grant was, raised a hand to get his attention and, noticing the quiet way the room responded to the gesture, immediately lowered it again and offered an apology for his tone. Grant acknowledged it without ceremony and went to see what the man needed. The room smelled of cedar and warm bread and the particular cold-weather candles. Ruth ordered every November, the same ones that had been burning on the night all of this began. Grant thought, crossing back toward the service station, about how strange and ordinary it was that the same hands that had negotiated a 9-figure agreement were the same hands that had been refilling water glasses in this building for 5 years, that neither version of that life had ever required the other to apologize for existing. Cora was still watching from the doorway. He caught her eye across the room. She smiled, that particular smile, the one she'd had since she was small, that said she understood something more than she was going to say out loud, and went back to her conversation. The evening moved on the way good evenings do, without needing to announce itself, and Grant moved with it, unhurried, in exactly the place he had chosen to be.